Welcome back. You're still watching The Globe. Now, what we're hoping is that in a few minutes' time, in fact, the president is there, so they're busy setting him up. He's going to be briefing the media now in the next couple of seconds to talk a little bit about the conversation that he had with President Joe Biden. Many things were on the agenda, and we discussed a few of those with our journalist Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who's covering the story for us there. A whole range of issues from trade, war in Ukraine, peace and security, and also this bill that the Americans are hoping to push through, which penalizes countries that are trading with Russia. But let's go to the US now.
Fruitful and very positive engagement with President Biden and the Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken. And earlier this morning, we saw Vice President Harris, who gave us breakfast, which was very nice. But our discussions with the U.S. government have really been extensive. Right now, with President Biden, I raised almost 20 issues that I felt we needed to cover. We didn't go into depth on all of them, and the issues ranged from trade and investment, how we can continue creating a very good environment for American companies to invest in South Africa. We've got some 600 American companies invested in South Africa in a whole range of sectors, and they were positively disposed towards even encouraging more U.S. companies to invest in South Africa because they see us continuing with the reforms and continuing to create a climate that's conducive for business to invest. And I could say that was possibly one of the key areas that we came to the U.S. to further the interests of South Africa. And we also discussed the just energy transition, which we discussed at length. And in our discussion with President Biden, we said, much as we reached a deal in Glasgow with the European partners, they being the European Union, France, Germany, and the UK, as well as the US. On further look, we find that we are going to need much more than what has been pledged to have an effective and a just transition where we do not leave anyone behind. And I was hugely, hugely impressed with President Biden's grasp of the challenge that we face. We said, if we are to transition to renewables as we move on, 2030 and beyond, we are literally going to need another $38 billion in support. So there is a shortfall of $38 billion on top of the 8.5, and we are processing the whole issue of coming up with an investment case and a business plan. But it's quite clear to us that to have a just transition does not leave anyone behind, a just transition that will help in the creation of jobs, so that as people transit from fossil fuel type of jobs and move on to renewable energy type of jobs, they should feel that they have not been left behind. We discussed the AGOA forum that we are going to hold, and the U.S. is positively disposed to that. We also discussed the issue of global security, stability and security, and specifically we discussed the insurgents attacks that are going on in Mozambique, and we called on the U.S. to lend a further hand in that conflict. because if we do not, South Africa could find itself a target, and we need resources. South Africa, as it is now, is the biggest contributor in terms of troops, apart from Rwanda, which is doing so on a bilateral basis. And that too was well received, and further discussions will need to happen with the US on this one. We discussed COVID, and we appreciated the support that we've received from the US in the form of various resources, including vaccines. But we also said that the job is not done yet. We need to be fully supported when it comes to vaccine manufacturing. We also appreciated the stance that was taken by the US and the World Trade Organization. But we said that we now need to finish that process or negotiations so that the deal should cover therapeutics as well as diagnostics. We appreciated the support we get from the United States in relation to health, where through PEPFAR we've received enormous support, particularly on HIV and AIDS and tuberculosis. And we said in the end, South Africa still being the COVID-19 champion, we're now seized with the task of improving health systems on our continent, and that too will need support. We also raised the issue of the steel and aluminium Section 232 tariffs that have been imposed, and we said that that was not fair. We would like those to be reviewed so that our steel and aluminium producing companies should take up the opportunities of exporting to the US without having tariffs being imposed on them. We also discussed the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and said that we're looking forward to this as an enabler for industrialization and manufacturing, and would like the US to be more supportive as well. The other important issue we raised was the issue of infrastructure support that President Biden and myself discussed on the telephone a few months ago when we had a 45-minute telephone call. And we agreed then during the telephone conversation that our Minister of Trade, of International Relations and Secretary of State would take the discussions forward, which they did when Secretary Blinken visited South Africa. So they are now engaged in what we call a strategic dialogue forum where they are discussing this matter. Food security came up, and we discussed this in the light of the engagement we had with the G7 in Brussels when we raised the issue of Africa needing to have more security when it comes to food production. And the issue of fertilizers came up, that in order for us to have food security on the continent, we do need to have homegrown fertilizer production, like we are now doing so with vaccines. So we identified this as an area of intervention where we will need support. I was rather pleased to hear that the US is going to be holding a discussion soon, and we are going to be moving forward with a proposal as South Africa, working together with the President of the EU on the issue of fertilizer production on the continent. We also discussed the issue of the Malign Russian Activities bill. We raised this as a concern that if that bill were to go through, it would marginalize Africa, because it would seem like Africa would now be punished for having partners, a partner like Russia, and for the most part, most of African countries are non-aligned, and we expressed the view that it would be unfair for the US to punish African countries by just merely either associating with Russia on an economic basis or a business basis, and that we put forward. We also raised the issue of sanctions against Zimbabwe and argued that the sanctions that are imposed on Zimbabwe have a collateral damage on us as South Africa, in that as they implement those sanctions against Zimbabwe, it weakens the Zimbabwean economy, resulting in Zimbabweans leaving Zimbabwe in droves, going to neighboring countries, South Africa's Botswana and Namibia, and we then suffer collateral damage as a result of that, because as they come to our countries, they obviously want services which we have to provide, and it imposes a burden on our own countries. We discussed the issue of the African Union needing a seat on the G20, and we felt that that should be given consideration, because South Africa, in the end, as I recall, is the only country that is a member of the G20, and we attend the G7 by invitation often. And we need to spread the responsibility for representing African views, and we feel strongly that the AU, African Union, should be a member of the G20, much as they are a continental organization, just like I think the EU is a member. We discussed and raised the issue of skills development with President Biden, and felt that said we would like the US to support us in the development of skills for civil servants. We want to professionalize our civil service, and we would like to be supported so that we can send some of our key civil servants to institutions like the Kennedy School of Government, like the Thunderbird institution, so that they can get training specifically for women who are in the civil service in South Africa. We also raised the issue of gender empowerment, that we would like this to be an important priority. We also raised this with Vice President Harris and proposed to her that it would be good during the summit that President Biden is going to have African leaders in December, that maybe on the sidelines she should convene a meeting of African ministers who are seized with the issue of empowerment of women and women's rights. And one of the other last things which I could mention here that we raised was the reform of the United Nations Security Council particularly, and argued that it is totally unfair that 1.3 billion people in the world are not represented on the UN Security Council, and that that is an anomaly, that is unfair, that should be corrected. So we had a whole list of issues to raise, and I'd like to say that most of the issues that we raised were warmly received. And of course, as you would expect, we also discussed the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and our position on this is respected, it is known and recognized, and of course we both also expressed a view that we would like this conflict to come to an end as quickly as possible. So we had really good discussions with President Biden, as with Vice President Harris as well. So our visit to the US, being a working visit, has been a really productive visit, and we think we have deepened and further matured the relations between South Africa and the United States. United States is an important trade partner to South Africa, and we're also getting a lot of tourists. There's been a huge increase of tourists from the United States to South Africa, and it's been important for us to come and strengthen the relations between the two countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I think I've answered all your questions, so why don't you go home?
Sherwin looks satisfied. We'll do a round of questions. We'll start with Sherwin, Simon, and then Karim.
So I'll start with three short ones. Mr.
Yes.
President, good to see you. Welcome back to the United States. Can I start with two? Please indulge me to start with two domestic issues.
Yes.
Your reaction to Parliament Speaker appointing a three-person panel headed by former Chief Justice Sandile Ngcobo that must determine whether there is a prima facie case to answer on the Phala issue. Secondly, several provinces have indicated that you are the preferred candidate to run for a second term as ANC President. Will you be accepting those nominations?
Is that a fact?
I'm hearing this.
Okay.
And finally, on the international front, you mentioned Ukraine. What the U.S. administration said previewing your trip was that they were wanting to hear from South Africa. Quote, as this conflict has evolved, we are eager to hear South Africa's perspective on how we reach a just conclusion to the conflict and what are the means to do that. So this seems to be an opening. Naledi Pandor, the Minister of International Relations, has talked about a panel of eminent persons. What is South Africa's position on how we end this conflict?
Well, let me start off with the domestic issues. I have noted the panel that has been appointed by the Speaker. That is a parliamentary matter which is unfolding. And as I've said, I will abide by whatever the processes in Parliament come up with. And I forever remain prepared to cooperate and to engage with the process as well as the individuals that have been appointed to the panel. So it's not for me to say I prefer that one or that one. It's what the Speaker in her own right has decided on, so I'll go along with that. I too have noted some of these sentiments that are coming through from the provinces, and the nomination process is going to start soon, and I will wait for that nomination process. You know, when I was elected Deputy President in 2012, I had to wait until the very last moment to sign the form, because you have to sign an acceptance form. So it's not for me to say what the stance is now. It is for those who are nominating to do their work, to make their preferences, and thereafter, after observing all that, I'll then be asked in a very formal sense whether I accept nomination or not. So I wait for that as a disciplined member of the African National Congress. When it comes to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, President Biden did say that South Africa has a very important moral voice in the world, and we should not take that lightly. We should find ways in which any form of assistance that can be given in helping to bring this conflict to an end, and we agree with that. Clearly, the conflict has to be resolved, and as we have often said, our view is that this conflict can best be resolved through dialogue and negotiations, and we were very appreciative of the move that was taken by the Secretary General of the UN when he intervened to open the sea channels for grain to be exported from Ukraine. And we do believe, I still strongly believe, that the Secretary General is the best placed person who can help to engender dialogue and to find a way of bringing about peace in that part of the world. I do think that his office carries such weight, and assisted by, if you like, elders or wise men and women, I do believe that he can bring to bear quite a lot of weight on this, and there can be a solution. Obviously, conflicts are very difficult to solve. Sometimes there are stops and starts, steps backwards and forwards, but one has to remain committed and in a dogged way to keep on trying to herd the conflicting parties to a particular direction and a conclusion. I do believe that that should be the case. And as for South Africa, we can play a supportive role. We do have channels, communication channels open to both sides, and we have been able to talk to both sides. And each time we have stressed the issue of negotiations, and following the very strong view that was expressed by President Biden, we will see what role can be played, but I still store a lot of confidence in the role of the Secretary General of the United Nations.
Simon?
Mr. President, thank you very much. It's good to see you here as well. Very nice to have you in Washington. You were very outspoken at the embassy about the Countering Russia's Malign Activities in Africa Act,
yeah,
and seemingly raised it directly with President Biden as well. Shortly before you entered the Oval Office, the President's National Security Council spokesman said that there's no punishment here. The United States is not making anybody choose. We respect sovereignty. There's no punishment envisaged in this legislation. I know you're going to be speaking to members of Congress who have actually authored the legislation later tonight.
Yes.
Did you get any sense from President Biden about what he's going to do if the legislation passes the Senate? Are you asking him, if necessary, to veto that legislation if it reaches his desk? I'd also like to ask you about the just energy transition. You said that you had expressed the view that South Africa now needed another 30 billion, and that you were impressed by President Biden's grasp of the issue. But what did President Biden commit to, if anything, in terms of that 30 billion? What's the status of that conversation? And on the issue of Ukraine, if I can come back to that, your BRICS colleague, Prime Minister Modi of India today, at the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that's been underway in Uzbekistan, confronted Vladimir Putin directly and rebuked him over the war in Ukraine and said this is not an era for war, and said it needs to stop. Does that make you more ready to engage in a similar expression of sentiment towards Vladimir Putin on South Africa's behalf, were the opportunity to arise?
Okay. On the legislation, obviously, we've raised the issue of the legislation that is being piloted in the U.S. Congress, and we've expressed our discomfort and our opposition to it, because we do believe that in the end, if it is passed, it will identify those countries in Africa that have some relationship or so with Russia. It could be a trade one, it could be an investment one, it could be an economic one, and we do believe that that could be a punishing type of act. So I think it will harm Africa. It will marginalize our continent, a continent that is now seeking to recover from the after effects of COVID-19. And I think it's a misplaced type of legislation that also would touch on the sovereignty of African countries. As African countries, we really take great pride in our own sovereignty and should not be told by anyone who we associate with. And we should never be put in positions where we have to choose who our friends are. We should, of our own volition, choose who our friends are and should not be subjected to a form of having to choose. So we refuse to do that. Now, President Biden has to decide himself what he will do. I'm not able to speak on his behalf. What we have done is to express our very strong opposition to this. And tonight, you're right, I will be engaging with those Congress people or senators who have authored or who are authoring this legislation and just inform them how harmful this is going to be. On the one hand, President Biden, as I said, is going to convene a meeting of African leaders in December, which unfortunately I will not be able to attend because I've got an elective party conference. And he will be seeking to engage and to cooperate with African leaders. And on the other hand, if this legislation goes through, it will undo precisely what President Biden is seeking to do. So it is counterproductive. On the just energy transition issue, we expressed a view that there's a shortfall, a deficit, in our view, of about 38 billion. And we said we are going to need more funding. And I was pleased to hear President Biden saying countries such as ours and other countries do need to be supported to embark and fully embrace the just transition. And we need to get more funding. And he did say that he will want to raise this with other G7 partners. And we welcome that because that for us is a very positive disposition to the challenge that we are going to face. And he was even much more detailed in his explanation about coal miners who could lose jobs. How do you go and tell a coal miner, and as he said, that you're going to lose your job and that will be the end of it? And his view, which I subscribe to and support fully, is that we should be able, as we transition from fossil fuels to renewables, to be able to create jobs, to train people, and so that they don't lose their work situations, because that is very much of their identity. And he also went on to say those communities, and he called them the fence line communities, that are going to be more heavily affected by the transition, should be supported quite fully. Yes. Is it falling? Thank you. Gee. I didn't know you could be my dresser, Sherwin.
Do we leave on the same plane tomorrow?
There was a question that you raised, I just wrote. Oh, sentiment, yes.
Narendra Modi.
Yeah, Narendra Modi, yes. We've always said that we would like to see this war coming to an end, and I have expressed as much to President Putin himself. Wars are destructive in their nature. They are devastating. They don't only destroy lives, but also infrastructure and everything else. So we have said as much, and this war has gone on for far too long and needs to be brought to an end. And as we have always said, those who are part of this whole drama of the war should now be serious about sitting around the table and finding solutions. And that is why we say the United Nations Secretary General and various other eminent persons should get involved in negotiating this conflict to an end, and it must come to an end soon.
Thank you. Karen?
Thank you so much. Mr. President, I'm representing Sunday Times and Times Live on this trip. I have two quick questions. The one is the investments that you talked about to President Biden, the American investments in South Africa. What obstacles do they see in terms of what's making their lives difficult there, and you know, what if they raise as concerns? And I'm just wondering, does this Countering Malign Activities, nobody can get the name right.
Yes.
This Countering Malign Russian Activities bill, might it have unintended consequences and a knock-on effect on American businesses themselves there? I was just suddenly wondering if it could have some unintended consequences. And then the question about democracies, President Biden mentioned, I think we both live in interesting democracies at the moment. Is there anything that we can learn from the US? I don't know, maybe you discussed it, maybe not.
Well, I think there is a lot that we can all learn from each other. I think it's best put like that, because we live in a very uncertain world now. And there are so many things that continue to unfold that constitute challenges all round, either to our democracies, to our economies, to our people. And we are living through the effects of all the horrible things that have happened to us as a country: COVID, the unrest, the floods, and obviously poverty, unemployment, and inequality persists. So much that we can learn from the US in navigating our way around all the challenges that we all face in the world. The unintended consequences, yes, there would be unintended consequences. If, for instance, this malign Russia activities bill goes through, I do think it will also affect American companies. So it's best that that bill should just be ditched, because the collateral damage and the damage it could wreak not only on the African continent but on relations between various nations and the United States is not something that any one of our two countries, or the US and various African countries, would want. The US officials who were with President Biden are pretty positive and gung-ho about investment opportunities in South Africa. They did not raise any obstacles with us. They just spoke more of what they see as opportunities and wanting to encourage more investment in South Africa. And I was very pleased today, even at the meeting that we had with the Congressional Caucus, there was a representative of a major company who said, "We're coming to South Africa to make a big announcement at your investment conference next year, and we're going to be making a big bet of an investment type in South Africa." And I was very, very pleased with that, and I said, yes, please do attend our investment conference. So in the end, we are going to exceed what I announced 4 years ago about our target for investments. And the US is one of the countries where we source investments that lead to the creation of jobs. So I'm really particularly pleased about the approach that the US has on South Africa as being an investment destination. I guess they look at all the challenges that we have. They also have their own challenges and still see that there are great opportunities for business in South Africa, notwithstanding the many challenges. And in fact, I got a sense that they see the challenges that persist in our country as an opportunity for them to partner with us even more, so that we can get over those challenges and create a more prosperous South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. Last question, Sebastian.
Mr. President, thank you. I'm Sébastien Hervieux, representing Africa Intelligence. You say you raise the issue of security and stability, especially in the north of Mozambique.
Yeah.
Do you think you will get more support from the United States, and what kind of support are you expecting? And do you have any idea of the timeline? Because the issue is quite pressing. And the second question is an international issue. There are several countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, who are willing to join the BRICS group. Do you think it will be in the interest of South Africa to expand this group? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. In relation to support, we urge the United States to be more supportive in helping us to ward off the insurgents. They are already giving support, and they recently, I think, announced that from a development point of view, they would also be doing some interesting interventions in Cabo Delgado. We want support for the fighting forces that are engaged with the insurgents in the form of resources and, of course, in the form of skills as well. And resources can range between financial support and otherwise. So we have been getting support from the US, but we want that to be increased because we need to ensure that those insurgents are completely driven out of Mozambique. And you're absolutely right. It's urgent. Timelines were not really discussed, but all we could say is that this is urgent. BRICS is an association of the 4 countries. Are we 5? We're 4? We're 5. 5 countries. Yeah, of course, including South Africa. And there have been approaches from a number of countries, some on the African continent and beyond, who would want to join this or be part of this family. And as you know, some have also been accepted to be part of the new development bank. So they would now like to be formally part of BRICS. That is a matter that is going to be discussed. South Africa is in the new year going to be heading the BRICS process leading up to the summit that we will hold. So the matter will be discussed amongst the 5 BRICS partners, and so we will see where that goes. Are we supportive? We are supportive of ensuring that African countries do, in the end, get represented in important forums in the world. For instance, in the G20 and various others. And that is why we are also saying we want Africa to be represented on the United Nations Security Council. It is important that the African voice should be heard and should be heeded so that people get a better appreciation of where Africa wants to go, because we want to build the Africa that we want, and a lot needs to be done to ensure that Africa participates in as many forums as possible. So in the end, the matter of anyone wanting to join BRICS has to be discussed, and we will, without even saying that, they must come, we will want to discuss it properly with our 4 partners, and then take a decision on the basis of what BRICS stands for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Can I go home? Can I go home now?
London is not home.
You're right.
Should we have this first?
It's getting out, I think.
All right, so that's where we leave that media briefing that President Ramaphosa had with the media. They're speaking to the members of the media after his meeting with the US President Joe Biden. He said that his discussion included business between the two states, a just transition under the climate change lens. Also, the president said that we will need at least another $38 billion to get the job done. He said that he appreciated the US support in health. It was greatly appreciated. This as we try to improve our health systems, he says. He talked about steel and aluminium tariffs needing to be reviewed to make the playing field fair. He asked for US support over our Pan-African initiative, the Continental Free Trade Area. Food security came up, also discussed with concerns raised about homegrown fertilizer production facilities and capacity. The Malign Russian Activities bill, as predicted, came up and said that this will prejudice Africa and that this needs to be reviewed. In fact, later on, he said it needs to be scrapped completely. Zimbabwe sanctions came up, saying that the US sanctions in Zimbabwe has an effect on the region in general, with the movement of economic migrants seeking greener pastures into South Africa and other neighboring states. He says that African representation on bodies like the G20, that was put on the table. He says that this should happen much in the same way as the European Union. He talked about skills development, and that was another area that he asked for support, especially with the initiative of trying to professionalize the civil service here in South Africa. UN Security Council, another issue that always comes up, saying that representation there is considered an anomaly in the world that we live in today. He said that South Africa's position on the Ukraine-Russia conflict is respected. And speaking to our correspondent in that briefing, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, he says that the US sees South Africa perhaps as an important moral voice that could play an important role in finding a peaceful solution to the end of the conflict. And he's added, though, that the UN Secretary General might be the ideal person to negotiate peace in the region, with South Africa maybe playing a supportive role. All right, so that's what's come out of that meeting. We still have to wait and see how President Biden saw those issues, but this is what President Ramaphosa shared with members of the media a few minutes ago.